Welcome to The Business. I'm Larry Makinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. On this episode of The Business, Senegal issues a Eurobond, joining Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria as African government debt continues to attract investors. The Democratic Republic of Congo says its new mining law will not change, despite the president's meeting with mining industry leaders. And the Gates Foundation launches its first ever gender equality strategy, committing $170 million towards greater economic empowerment of women. In the big story, we look at U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's first official visit to Africa. Is the U.S. lagging behind China? And in the breakdown, we look at mobile money in Africa. Despite accounting for almost half the world's accounts, is mobile money failing to bring meaningful financial inclusion to Africans? Joining me throughout will be journalist, broadcaster, and Africa watcher Tamzanga Show. And in part two, I'll be talking to the Ethiopian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Haile Mikkel Abera Afewerk. Our first story, Eurobonds. Senegal has sold $2.2 billion worth of Eurobonds this week, joining other issuers, Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. Together, they've already issued more than 50% of last year's record total of $18 billion at $10.7 billion. It's all part of a borrowing spree across Africa. And Tam, I'm going to come to you on this one. What's driving all of this? We're seeing a lot of investor interest in these Eurobonds. Nigeria's was oversubscribed. Senegal's was oversubscribed. There's a lot of appetite out there. A lot of African countries want to issue them. Cote d'Ivoire is lining up. Angola is lining up. South Africa is lining up. What's this all about?
Well, Landry, two reasons. One, it is the demand. When you look at the yields, what we call the bond yields, you're talking about 6%.
Which is the highest in the world.
That is the highest in the world. When you compare that to maybe even America, the Fed post-Yellen probably will be tinkering with the interest rates, but you're still talking about 4%, 4.5%. Of course, the risk is lower. But if you were gambling and gambling well, then you will be looking at Africa where that yield is higher. But then you look at the other end as well. What is actually driving the decision within these capitals, Dakar in this particular instance? And you are talking about Pretoria coming up, maybe Angola, Rwanda, Accra, Ghana. So for them, there are political reasons as well as a definite need. There are quite a number of them who want to finance their external debt, and because the interest rates, the terms of what they had before are quite atrocious. So they want to try and sort that out. But by and large, these are countries that are post-election that are trying to drive this. But Senegal is a very interesting one. This might mean that there is confidence in Macky Sall's government, because you know that there are elections coming, but the flood, the interest is still on.
The Democratic Republic of Congo has said that a new contentious mining law is going to be signed unchanged, despite a meeting between President Joseph Kabila and mining industry leaders who have objected to a proposed hike on minerals in the country. Tam, this is a familiar issue across Africa. Yes. A lot of mineral-rich countries. There's always tension between the mining companies, who obviously want to pay as little as possible to the government, and the government that wants to get as much as possible out of its mineral resources. Who's right, who's wrong here? Is that the right way of looking at it?
Well, as we always say in business, it is always the fault of government, isn't it? When they want to increase, when they want to change the goalposts, you have already committed in terms of the investment in that particular country, and then the goalpost will be changed when you have committed capital and all that. This is what the companies that are already invested in the Democratic Republic of Congo have been arguing. But by and large, when you look at the government needs, especially for the DRC, Kinshasa needs the money, and
is the money going to be spent properly?
Well, it's always a political question. One would think that for a country that is as big as the DRC, no one knows how many people there are. There's no proper census that has been done. There are estimates that there are probably 100 million people out there, the majority of whom don't have access to the resources in their own country. And so there's a worry that this Kabila government will be going out soon. They have said in December, if elections are held, even if it's a new group of people, Kabila shouldn't be there constitutionally. So what's going to happen to the money between now and then? But as long as they can be guaranteed it will be given to business and to the people who need it, then that will be fine.
As long as they can guarantee that, we'll have to wait and see. The Gates Foundation, the world's biggest philanthropic fund, has announced its first ever gender strategy. They're going to commit $170 million to women's economic empowerment across Africa and other parts of the developing world. They're going to focus on connecting women with markets, driving financial inclusion, and looking at key issues like land ownership and land tenure. Tam, this comes on the back of International Women's Day. It's good news. We've got the world's biggest philanthropic entity for the first time focusing specifically on women. Big move.
I don't know if we should say it's good news, because it's a shame on African governments in particular, or even those that are going to be recipient to this particular fund, in that they are failing to do exactly that. Because we know that in most parts of the world where there is poverty, the women are the ones that look after the land. The women are the ones that generate that wealth. So they need the markets and access to it. They need the capital for the inputs, and they need to be sustained through a monitoring process and all the support that they need throughout. It'll
be interesting to see how this unfolds. One thing about the Gates Foundation is they do have a more private sector driven approach. For our big story, we'll look at the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's first official visit to Africa this week. He used the opportunity to pledge $533 million in food aid, but he's also used the opportunity to criticize China. He said a lot of negative things about Beijing, suggesting that African countries are signing away their sovereignty and they need to be a bit more careful. Tam, we've been here before. This all sounds a bit dated. China and Africa is a reality. Is he behind the curve?
Well, it would look like the Americans, or probably most of the West, have been in an economic Chinese wall. They closed themselves and believed that Africa is all about aid, and that is what forms the relationship. But the Chinese have planned long term and realized that what Africa needs is infrastructure, and they are tied to those relationships. And China will always say they won't interfere in the politics of what happens in Africa. They won't talk about human rights. They will simply deal with whatever government is in place. So now the Americans are worried. Rex Tillerson is worried. So he's going through Africa and say, hey, remember, you might be tied to these debts in the infrastructure. Whatever money the Chinese use, you will be made to pay at a later date. But the Americans, aid is no longer going to cut it.
Like it or not, China is here to stay in Africa. This week's breakdown, we look at mobile money in sub-Saharan Africa. The region leads the world with almost half of all deployments globally. Average daily transactions are now at $1.2 billion, and the region accounts for 50% of active users, some 122 million active accounts on the continent. Tam, we all know mobile money has been one of the big success stories in Africa over the last decade. Good news, this has to be a success story.
Well, East Africa and Kenya in particular started this down from the village to the streets of the capital in Nairobi, and it has worked well for them. What happens is in Southern Africa, you find that this is not going on so much because there is oversubscription in terms of financial institutions. And
not just Southern Africa, but across the continent.
Yes, in other parts of the continent, it is an issue about internet, the connectivity aspect. But in West Africa, it is simply the issue of whether there's leadership in government for them to be allowed to allow the private sector, the banks, the financial institutions to push this through.
Regulation is the key issue, and in East Africa, especially Kenya, the regulation has been right, but it's kind of been lagging behind elsewhere.
It has been, but most of the African countries can learn lessons from what has happened in East Africa. But then also remember the people that are the key players in this, the mobile phone companies. You're talking about MTN, the Econets in Southern Africa and in Nigeria. What then happens is there could be resistance from some of the people who believe that this new product will be competition.
Some 66% of sub-Saharan Africans still don't have bank accounts, so surely this is an opportunity.
Well, I think it needs people like you, Lanre, to go and convince the central banks that that is actually going to be the case. That appears to be the case in most of these areas where life is different once this kicks in. But where they still believe that they don't understand it fully, then there will still be problems and resistance.
Well, hopefully the success that we've seen from companies like M-Pesa in Kenya will help convince central banks that this is the right way to go. We'll take a quick break now. Join me in part 2 of the business when I will be talking to the Ethiopian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Haile Michael Abera Afewerk. Welcome back to The Business, the show where we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. I'm delighted to be joined by the Ethiopian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Haile Michael Abera Afewerk. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining me on The Business today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Ethiopia has been in the news quite a lot in recent weeks. We had the unexpected, surprising resignation of the Prime Minister a few weeks ago. Since then, a lot has happened. We've seen a state of emergency declared, which has caused a lot of headlines, some criticism globally. I'd like to start on this point. The European Union has come out and said that Ethiopia needs reforms. It does not need a state of emergency. The US Secretary of State, of course, has just been in Ethiopia this week. He has also voiced some concerns around the state of emergency that's been declared. Do you think that this criticism is justified? Do you accept that that the government might be handling the situation in too strong a fashion, or is there more to this?
Thank you, Lanre. The state of emergency was declared principally to implement the reforms that have been put in place. Political reforms, particularly widening the political scope in the country, so the youth and many other groups could participate in the political process of the country. So the first thing is then the state of emergency was declared to ensure that there is peace and stability in the country, that the constitutional order is maintained, and that all differences should be discussed and ironed out through peaceful means. Now, in some parts of our country there have been protests following the youth demanding jobs. Basically, the country has produced a demanding society following the economic development, the rapid economic development of the country, the fastest growing economy in Africa.
For quite some years?
For some years, and because of the benefits that people have seen, they have become very demanding, particularly the youth.
So are we seeing a government that understands these demands?
The need was understood that we need to widen the political space for all voices to be heard in the country. What we need to underline here is that peace and stability should be maintained, and that the constitutional order and the federal system should be respected.
What needs to happen next to make sure that this actually happens? The widening of the political space is one of the key issues in Ethiopia. We know the dynamics of some of the majority ethnic groups being marginalized in the politics. What needs to happen next? We know that the announcement of a new prime minister is imminent, but what are the key steps that have to be taken to make sure that the country does not sort of slide into instability?
After the resignation of the prime minister, who is still, by the way, in office, and has been an example for many countries, voluntarily stepping down with the view to becoming part of the solution to the country's problems now. After his resignation, obviously, the ruling party needs to have its new leader. And therefore, there is this one process of electing a leader for the political party, for the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. Once that is done, then obviously the parliament will convene to endorse, to approve the new prime minister. Then obviously business will continue. The civil service is working. The country is peaceful. The people are peaceful. They demanded that peace and order should be maintained.
Do you see, there's been speculation that the new prime minister could come from either the Amora or Amara ethnic group, which of course are the major ethnic groups in Ethiopia. That could be quite a big step for the country. Do you think that that is a realistic prospect? How important is the selection of the new prime minister?
The EPRDF has its own rules and regulations that it has exercised for many years now as a ruling party. And based on the rules and regulations, democratically, a new leader will be elected. It could be from any ethnic group. It's a democratic system. It's a democratic party.
Okay, I understand. I understand why you're not willing to speculate on that. But so the selection of a new prime minister, as you've already mentioned, is going to be pivotal in helping the process of political opening. And we've touched on the economy. Ethiopia has been one of the best performing economies in Africa for some time. Have the events of recent weeks, have they derailed some of the progress that's been made in terms of investment, in terms of growth? Do you see it potentially posing a risk, or are the government's priorities still very much in line and intact when it comes to driving economic growth?
Landry, this is a transitory phenomenon that many countries that have gone through transformation have witnessed. You see, when a country is growing, and growing fast at that, as I said, new demands come up. Political demands, demands for democracy, demands for jobs, for business, and all that. So this is a transitory period we're going through. Once, the reforms are that have been put in place are implemented and investment is encouraged, and as has been the case so far, then obviously things will settle down. There is no doubt. The people have lived together for centuries, and Ethiopia's history dates back to the second or third millennium BC. And so there are a lot of shared values. And with diversity, they have lived together, coexisted together, and I have no doubt that this would be just a transitory period.
What are the priorities going forward in terms of consolidating the economic growth that we've seen? We know that Ethiopia is investing a lot in building its manufacturing base and becoming a manufacturing hub in Africa. You've mentioned the key role of the youth. Job creation is an important priority. What is the checklist when it comes to the next 5 or 10 years of economic development for the country? And how are you going to make that happen?
Well, that's pushing forward with the development first of all, because the development will solve. By development, I mean social development, education, health, investment. So as you said, Ethiopia is building industrial parks. So investors don't have to go from place to place looking for land. It's a one-window approach, if you like. Internet, telephone, water, electricity, all in one place. So this has been really an attractive state of affairs in Ethiopia.
It's attracted some international brands.
Absolutely. So that's the investment in the industrial parks. Also agro-processing industry, which will definitely create jobs for millions of people in the rural areas. As you said, 70% of the population of Ethiopia is under 35 years of age, as indeed is the case in all African countries. And therefore, these will create jobs, millions of jobs with the investment and capacity building. So the priority for Ethiopia in the economic sphere is really more investment coming to the country, more jobs created in the country, in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas. So you have textile and garment in the manufacturing sector, you have agro-processing, and the export promotion and attraction of investment. These are, and of course the widening the political space, the democracy. These are the priorities as indicated in the reform.
We're running out of time, but quickly, one last question. It's a bit of a big question, but I need a quick answer as well. Are we witnessing an important moment in Ethiopian history here?
As I said, Ethiopia is not a new country. It's centuries old. And I said there are a lot of shared values that the people have internalized over the years. It's only transforming the country with a view to developing its economy, developing its social sphere, so that we become more, shall I say, modern country, solving our own problems ourselves, and therefore that there is nothing new really. The people are there to push on with the
So we're seeing
reforms.
evolution rather than a revolution in Ethiopia.
Yes, you can put it that way.
Ambassador, we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for coming in and joining me on The Business today.
Thank you, Landry. Thank you.
From all of us here at The Business, thank you for watching. Please join us again next time.